Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the state of the Malazan Empire. Yes, we're back. We're starting to talk about Knight of Knives today. We're going to finish it tomorrow, I suspect, because it's a short book, and I've just read half of it. So that means I'm all the way up to and including chapter 3, Hounds of Shadow. Obviously, there's like 2 prologues and stuff, so this is very much like the 50% mark of the book. We're going to do the rest, ideally, tomorrow. We'll see how all of that works. So this will be your Malazan books, Malazan videos for this week. We'll certainly have something else next week. I mean, what I mean by that is obviously Return of the Crimson Guard. And we'll start on that one. It'll probably take 2 weeks to go through, I guess. But let's talk a little bit Knight of Knives today, shall we? Well, cheers. So, Knight of Knives is the first novel of the Malazan Empire. It came quite a bit later than the first couple of books of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about a little bit here for today before we get into like the meat of the thing. That is there's a foreword written by Stephen Erickson where he explains once again the origin of the Malazan universe in like 1982 through gaming and all of that stuff that Cam Esselmont and him did. And this is obviously to make once again clear that this is a shared world, and Esselmont's contributions to it are just as vital, if not more vital, than Stephen Erickson's. And sadly, this is obviously something that we still face in the Malazan fandom, where a lot of people are like, the Holy Grail is the Big Ten, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and Esselmont's writing are often, dismissed as of lesser quality or whatever, which I obviously disagree with and think it's absolute bullshit, but it certainly is still there. It kind of ties in with the whole arrogance thing I spoke about earlier, like a couple of days ago. People think that the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because of its density and all kinds of themes in there, is, for whatever reason, a better book than any other book. Which is, wrong, because A, there's a lot of themes and stuff going on in the novels of the Malazan Empire as well. B, those are different styles of writing and so forth. And that's important to keep in mind. So we have Stephen Erickson explaining that in the foreword, but apparently not a lot of people listen to him, or not enough people listen to it. But I guess that's kind of the problem that all fantasy authors, all authors in general, face. It's like they say this is it, and then their fans go out and just misinterpret that as much as possible to fit it into their own worldview. So, now we've gotten that out of the way, let's look at Knight of Knives and what it does, and I'll come back to, to wrap it up tomorrow, but this is just like the first half of it. Knight of Knives is a rather short novel, and has a very tight focus. That tight focus, especially when it comes to, its time, is it is one night. Day and night, but mostly night. It also has a very tight focus locally, because it all takes place on the island of Malaz, with, the whole, shifting into other warrens kind of thing happening as well, but even then, it's more like a overlapping of different warrens, which, is the kind of thing that will happen every then and now in Malaz Island when we talk about the Shadow Moon thing. So that is something that I feel is important to keep in mind, because that means that your novel has to follow specific rules and work differently than something as extensive in scope, not in scope, but in both in time and space as some of the novels, volumes in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, where we, traverse between continents and like the entire, I don't know how long time wise, say, the story, how long it actually takes in the Bone Hunters from like the beginning of the Bone Hunters to the end, or House of Chains spreads like, well, not it spreads continents, and it spreads like over a couple of decades, I guess, or at least a decade, something like that, in time. So that calls for a very, very different style, a very different, way of putting things, organizing things, to make that kind of novel work. Whereas Night of Knives is much closer to what you might call a movie script. Which is a good point, because as we know, Malazan started out as movie scripts, and while that may have been Gardens of the Moon, and especially the part in Darujhistan, I feel that Night of Knives in a lot of ways echoes that. Because once again, we have a large part, when we look at Gardens of the Moon and Darujhistan, we have a large part of the novel, if you edit out all the Malazan stuff and focus on the crowd around the Phoenix Inn and everything, all of that is focused on one city on a relatively short time period, I guess a couple of weeks there, but still. So I feel it makes sense to compare those two in a lot of ways. Night of Knives just focuses on Malaz, one of the other really important cities in the Malazan Empire, or like in the stories around the Malazan universe. I feel that's a better way to put it, because Darujhistan is technically not part of the Malazan Empire. Anyway, so we focus around one city, one important city, and the character of that city is once again informing the narrative. That's something I wanted to talk about later on in a different place, like a different video. How place informs is sometimes its own character in the Malazan world, but not today. So this is very much an important factor when we talk about this novel. It is set in Malaz Island in one day, one night. It is super, like, Malaz is not a nice place to be. It's old, it's grey, it's grimy, it's foggy, rainy, and all these other things. It is not like, Darujhistan being that vibrant, alive, cosmopolitan place. No, Malaz is very much something different. So that's one thing that I feel permeates that novel very much. Once again, the movie example is really important here, because something like Night of Knives you could perfectly turn into one fantasy movie, because it's very focused on very specific things. We're going to come back to that tomorrow when we talk about the rest of it. But I just wanted to put it out here already. The next thing is that that novel spending one day and night, the way it's organized in chapters is also very much about a very specific structure that is much more apparent here than in some of the other books in the Malazan universe in general. We have when you look at like some of the chapter headings, like we have chapter names here, something that neither the Path to Ascendancy does, nor the Malazan Book of the Fallen or the Carcanas trilogy does, or obviously the God is Not Willing either. Like, chapters have names here, which is interesting. And some of them are pretty much dead giveaways what we're talking about. When the first one is called Portents and Omens or something like that, I always confuse it with that amazing album by the Lamp of Thoth, which is called Portents, Omens, and Dooms, which kind of suits the thing itself, but it's very much about that. We get like one chapter full of like omens, premonitions, setting the mood and the place and everything. That makes a lot of sense here as well. It's like, if you once again look at the movie analogy, that's sort of when we have our opening shots. We get introductions to all our like major players, those mostly being Temper and Kiska, and not much else actually at this point. And we get like establishing shots. We see Temper, the gruffy, the grumpy old veteran, who obviously has been much more than he is now, doing his Malazan thing, walking up and down, being annoyed by his officer who doesn't really understand him because he's a veteran, or the testing of that other veteran who's trying to, take the piss out of him and all of that. So we see Temper established as a character. That I feel is really well done. So we have these establishing shots. Each of those scenes in the first couple of chapters, especially in the first chapter, is very much about showing us what kind of character we're dealing with here. Same with Kiska. We have her doing her like running around, spying, sneaking, whatever thing. We get a lot of her like inner her thoughts that are about her wanting to prove herself. She's young. I mean, like the parallels to, or the comparison to Crocus in Garden of the Moon are, they offer themselves, but I don't think they are like a perfect idea to do that, because I don't want to, compare those two novels too much, because they are very different books about very different things by very different authors. But still, we see a young person trying to prove herself, having ambitions, being annoyed by this, the backwaters nature and smallness and stifling atmosphere in her home, something that I guess a lot of young people can identify with. She wants to prove herself. She knows she's good. She wants to be someone, go somewhere. Now, that's something obviously that Crocus in Garden of the Moon doesn't obviously really do, because he already lives in arguably the biggest, best, and greatest city in the world. And now that also once again tells us something about the character of the cities and thus the empires, right? Malaz is a shithole. Everyone in Malaz wants to get away from Malaz, so the expanding nature of the empire is kind of inherent in that way of looking at your like home, your island, and whatnot. Whereas Darujistan is very much self-contained. People in Darujistan are proud to be Darujistani. They think it's the greatest city in the world. Who would ever want to leave Darujistan? Which, explains why Darujistan is a free city and not ruling the entire continent of Genobakis. Now, I know that there's other things in there, and we're going to get to that when we read and talk about Orb Scepter Throne. But right now, I feel that serves as an explanation and a comparison. And Crocus and Kiska kind of embody those things. They're also like a very good way for us to gain entry into those settings, because they are young, they are open in their thoughts, they're very direct in their thoughts. They also don't know everything about the world, they don't know everything about the place, so we as readers can learn with them. Whereas on the other hand, we have Temper, who knows way too much and has ignored most of that and is trying to not think about it. So also there we have for the reader, a way to be introduced to lore and setting and history aspects over time, by Temper grudgingly admitting certain memories, certain aspects to his consciousness in a way, and thus introducing them to us, the readers. Oh, another thing that I feel is like really important. The first establishing, like in the first prologue, establishing shot basically of the Storm Riders, that gigantic threat, the ship that gets frozen over. It kind of reminded me of that opening scenes of the prologue of Game of Thrones in a way. I'm not going to compare those two books. I'm just saying that those two prologues do something very similar, because they introduce an outside force of nature kind of threat that will at some point get close to the actual setting. In this case, the island of Malaz, or in Game of Thrones' case, obviously the Seven Kingdoms, or at least the North. So we have that scene in the beginning that establishes that outside threat, that supernatural threat that will loom over the island of Malaz during the entire thing there. Because what we have as another thing that will happen here, and that is important to understand, is that everything that happens on Malaz during the events of Night of Knives is internal power struggles, which will lead to, not lead, but kind of ignore the outside threat. And that is something that we see in at least the first parts of the Song of Ice and Fire series as well. That being that the internal struggles within the Seven Kingdoms and all that bullshit that goes on there will harm and damage and weaken the defenses of all of humanity, or all of the Seven Kingdoms in Game of Thrones, when it comes to fighting the outside, external, supernatural, overwhelming threat of the north, of the White Walkers and what have ya. Now here it is, we see that established outside threat that will come and possibly crush Malaz Island. We'll see about that tomorrow. And then we focus on the events in the city, which are very much internal at this point. Now scale will ramp up. We already can sense that, but right now it's all internal struggles. It's claws fighting, it's stupid shadow cultists fighting, it's bridge burners in town doing bridge burners things or mercenary things at this point. All of this shit's going on, and we as the readers know that there's an outside threat. Now, why is this an important thing? Because it's once again something that we will need to talk about more when it comes to talking about Ian Esselman's style and what he does here. It's we have a different point of view as the reader compared to the reader in, say, the Malazan Book of the Fallen. We have, it's third person limited, is sort of still, but with that first prologue we kind of know more than the people on the ground, and we as the reader can fret for them fucking it all up and dying or losing everything because they are focused too much on their personal struggles. Now that is obviously also something that is a greater theme. It's that to be aware that we oftentimes focus too much on personal struggles, goals, and aims, and lose the overall dangers of existence as a species out of sight. You will lose sight of those, right? Let's talk about stuff like climate change, and I'm obviously going to bring that up because it's a big one right now in general. Or talk about that blasted pandemic that's still kind of holding us indoors or something like that, at least. The point is that internal power struggles and small-minded goals for personal gain hold us as a species back and prevent us from actually putting our best foot forward to fight those global problems, because we're stupid as a species a lot of the time. So we focus on gaining the upper hand in whatever thing it is, our city against other cities, our county against other counties because we're struggling for money, our state against other states within the Confederacy, not the Confederacy, but the state in general, the countries against each other within the European Union for us Europeans. And it's ridiculous because we could be so much better if we would do something else. Now, having that external, that outside look through that, with that outside threat that we as the reader have with Night of Knives here, could be something that we should take maybe as a warning to sometimes change our perspective and look at the overall big picture, which, once again, is something that we'll see with Stephen Erickson, not so much because our focus is a closer one, but we'll see it, for example, with Erickson, for example, in Rejoice, which also is very much about figuring out how not to focus too much on the small picture and finally getting our shit together. Also, you should read Rejoice. It's a good book. Anyway, so that's something that I find interesting here. It also is very, very cinematic. Let's face it. The opening scene with the ice coming and people slowly freezing over, and the icebergs and the storm riders showing up. if you'd ever make a movie, this one would be a perfect opening scene. You have that, and then you have the title Night of Knives, and then you jump in and have the establishing shots of all those people on Malaz, and that's how you. It reads very much like a movie script, which once again makes sense, because as we learn in the foreword, that's what Cam and Steve worked on for a long time. So yeah, we have those establishing shots in the omens, portents, omens, and dooms. I'm just gonna keep on calling the chapter that. Chapter. We learn a bit. We get like our point to look at where in time, where in imperial, like the overall Malazan timeline we are, and the way this is done is by once again pointing at an event from the first Malazan Book of the Fallen novel, Gardens of the Moon, especially to the prologue. You remember the prologue in Gardens of the Moon with Ganoas Paran and what's his name, Whiskey Jack, and all those other people standing up in Moxhold and looking down at the Mouse Quarter burning. These events in the Mouse Quarter, the riots and all of that, are also the anchoring event in Night of Knives. Well, Night of Knives takes place after those events, but they are sort of what changes a lot of things, what influences a lot of things that happen later on, and because we get like a firm, like this happened, I don't know, 3 years ago, something like that, 2 years, 3 years, I keep forgetting because I'm not good with time. I tend to forget my own birthday, so why would I remember times in books? Anyway, point is, we get that, and we see, so we know where we are. Obviously, we kind of know that because everyone is talking about Kellanved returning, so the Emperor is still not, Lysine is not yet Empress, but Surly or Lysine is just the regent, because Kellanved and Dancer are somewhere. So we already know that we are sort of before what happens later on, but we also get that very concrete event on Malaz Island that kind of introduces us to what will happen later on. And this is another thing here, that there's a parallel between Kiska and Ganoas Paran, because it's events there that start their journey. And for Kiska, it's the meeting with the fisherman. Now, the fisherman is someone I wanted to talk about anyway. The fisherman reminds me a lot, that we're talking about how to play with literature and so forth. And the fisherman, for me, I might be wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong, or if you know more about it. My point is, the fisherman is very much for me a commentary, subversion, or I would say commentary on the role, the character, or whatever you want to call it, of Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings. Now, we know that Stephen Erickson he has said it a lot of times that for him, The Lord of the Rings was never an influence for the Malazan, but as far as I know, that's not the case for Ian Esselmond. And the way that we see that fisherman, who also shows up at the end of Kellanved's Reach, just saying, as the ancient guardian, there he's mentioned as an ancient guardian, that like there's rumors about him existing as a savior guardian of the island. And, Tom Bombadil is called eldest in Lord of the Rings and so forth. But what really made it more obvious for me is like he's going out, he has a wife. Well, in this case, she's obviously old and blind, but, we're not talking about that now. The point is, he goes out to save the island. He rows around, apparently opposes the storm, the attack of the Storm Riders, and he does that by rowing there and singing away their influence. And the kind of song he sings about his love and him rowing in the summer really reminded me a lot of what Tom Bombadil does when he goes out and fights Old Father Tree not Old Father Tree, but Old Willow Man. See, I get confused. Old Father Tree is obviously the tree god in the Black Company novels, but I'm getting confused here. My point is that I would say this is one other thing that we can get used to with Ian Esselman's writing, is he's certainly using a lot more, like, not certainly using a lot more, but he's certainly willing to make more direct references to the corpus of fantasy literature in a way, with things like the fisherman there, who's an unnamed fisherman at this point, going out and being something of a parallel to Tom Bombadil. He's obviously way more than that, right? That's the other bit there. He just fulfills a similar role. He might be inspired by that. I don't know. So there's that. But he also seems to be the person that kind of gets Kiska on her way, because we have that flashback scene about her being during the riots when she sees soldiers beating up that old fisherman who magically vanishes later on. So he might just be the same guy, like as a first signifier that Kiska is aware, at least, of things that are a bit out of the absolute normal, or that she's certainly has been noticed by powers, and that will lead her to whatever will happen later on. I mean, we will see. So, what's the point? So, we have the first chapter, Portents and Omens, and we have the second chapter, Assignations, which is where we kind of lay the groundwork and see where well, lay the groundwork, but see where the conflict first shows up. That the Shadow Moon will arrive. We hear about the Shadow Moon for the first time being some kind of specific, event that happens from time to time that will lead to all kinds of terrible things, monsters running around, portals opening, the whole 9 yards. We hear about that. We learn about the whole thing that there's mercenaries in Coop's Hangman Inn. We that are obviously up to no good, and so we're in the first chapter. We get like introductions to the characters that will show up. In the second one, we get like the introduction for things that will happen. It's like we learn that there's something afoot. There's like something big is coming. I mean, we knew that from the prologue, but now we know that there's something big coming on the island as well. There's all these people showing up that have no business showing up, and they are obviously up to no good. That's certainly what happens in Assignations, which once again makes sense with the chapter. So what Cam Esselman does here is he's very upfront about the structure of his book. His chapter headings, while they are not your old classic, when you read novels like from the 19th, 18th century, you oftentimes have these chapter headings that are like chapter 20, in which our hero does this, this, and this. It even happens in the best novel ever written, which is Winnie the Pooh. Whereas like we get introduced to Winnie the Pooh and some bees and stuff like that. So we get a clear, signifier what will happen in the following chapter, which just is an artistic decision, and one that I personally appreciate, but I feel it's important to be aware of that. Now the third chapter, Hounds of Shadow, does exactly that. Like, all hell breaks loose, people do a shitload of stuff, and the Hounds of Shadow are everywhere and are shown in all their fierceness and craziness. That's like the overarching theme of that third chapter. We see how puny human efforts are against it, but it also gives our main characters, Kiska and Temper, more room to show their skills, because they are obviously resourceful. They are either about brute strength, Temper, or about dexterity and willpower, which is Kiska. We also obviously get introduced to other characters that we've met before, especially if we've read the Path to Ascendancy series, like Agela. I guess people can start guessing who Artan is, which, Artan showing up under a similar name in Memories of Ice, for example. Anyway, my point is that this is sort of when the whole chaos happens, and we see what kind of level of, mostly chaos we are facing here. And that's where we kind of stop plot-wise for today, because I have to read the rest tomorrow. What else did I want to talk about with these chapters of? Oh, right. One thing that we learn already that I feel is interesting in the prose. I do like in Asselman's prose. It's a different style from from Stephen Erickson's, obviously, because they are different writers, they have different voices, and one thing that is, I feel, very deliberate in this one, it kind of tones down stuff like the Path to Ascendancy, but it is certainly here a lot, is the attention to detail. Now, there's places that we have met before, that I've seen before in other books. Agela's house, Coop's Hanged Man Inn. But they have never been described in that, I don't want to say exhausting detail, but in like a very, very minute details, And there's like two explanations for that. My first one is that Cam Asselman just really likes that. My second one is that, especially with Coop's Hanged Man Inn, when we get like basically a floor plan, it feels very much like someone, when game mastering this one, had to draw up a floor plan for a battle in that place, so they know exactly how that place looks and where the pillars holding up the ceiling stand and all of that. And just as an aside, we have a bar here in Marburg where I live, that, like, from the description, with the like very, very deep steep stairs down that remind Temper of a companionway of a ship, and the pillars in there and all of that, like, really reminded me of Coop's Hanged Man Inn. So that was just for me, for a personal recognition, like, oh, I've been to that bar. It's also a very cool bar in here where I live. So there's that. But it was just still like interesting to see. Also, when later on, when Temper pulls on his armor, we get like a more detailed description of armor, where Stephen Erickson's writing kind of assume that we know what parts of armor are, like what lobster tails are, what all these different bits of armor that I can't remember the words for right now are. Vambraces, Quite. The point is, we get like a way more detailed description here, like how to fasten, how they are fastened, how thick the leather is, and so forth. As I said, I like, from my memory, from later books, later novels than Last Empire, this attention to detail kind of fades out into the background later on, but it's very, very, prominent here, and something that I guess can become tedious if you want to turn that whole detail level of attention to detail up to 11. You go and read John Gwynn's Shadow of the Gods, where even I got annoyed by how detailed it got at some point. But it's still, I feel, something that maybe for like a first novel, someone really wanting to show off that their knowledge of what they're talking about, and it kind of comes across like that in a way. But it's, it's also true, and it's also realistic, so that's cool. Then I was like, really, people often say that there's, issues with the prose. I don't think there's issues with the prose. One thing that we have here is a more detached third person, so we get like thoughts of Kiska or Temper. But we usually get them in the prose as Temper thought this and this, or Temper had done this and this, and so forth, or Kiska thought this and this. Whereas what Stephen Erickson does, especially in later books, is really giving us those thoughts as an inner monologue. You have like it on, with characters like Bottle or Fiddler, you have that point where it's like, it's almost like those characters talking to us or to themselves. And this may feel, less, I don't know, immersive or whatever, but it's a conscious choice, and a fuck ton of other authors do that, and it still works extremely well. Also, I just wanted to, there's one situation where Esselman uses the word occult as a verb, and I just really love that moment. Something was occulting the moon. I'm like, that's so fucking cool. So bonus points for using that word in that way, and I'm really happy with it. So, as to bring this to an end for today, I fucking loved it. I mean, I've read it before, and I had remembered it as a cool book, but right now I'm like, it reads fast. It's gripping. It's cool. The overall like structure makes sense. The characters are cool. I like them all. It it's fun to read, and yeah, I can't wait to finish it tomorrow and then dive into Return of the Crimson Guard next week. So yeah, have you read the book? What's your thoughts on it? I can't wait to hear all of them. Thanks for watching. Please like, please subscribe if you haven't. All of the good things. Tell all your friends about it. You know. No, anyway, thanks for watching. I'm really glad you do. Anyway, until tomorrow, cheers.